Hi, folks. I'm Father Joe Grimaldi. You can call me Joe, and I'd like to welcome you to my podcast. But now, here's our host and friend, Ken Calvert.
Hi, everybody. It's Ken Calvert, and welcome back to the Father Joe podcast. I'm Ken Calvert, along with Father Joe Grimaldi. Today is April 25th, and that marks the feast of St. Mark the Evangelist. St. Mark the Evangelist, and just getting back from Mass, yeah?
Yeah, Ken, I just had Mass over at Saints Cyril and Methodius, celebrating the feast of this great evangelist. I think most people are familiar with the idea that, not the idea, but the fact that there are four evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yes.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke wrote more or less around the same time, and then John wrote much later. The evangelist really wrote the gospel for everyone. However, they always targeted to a certain group. Now, for example, when you think of Mark, he targeted his gospel to the people of Rome who were undergoing persecution. And so in order to give them hope and courage and so on, if you look at the trend of the gospel that he wrote, it says that in order to truly follow Jesus, you have to carry the cross. And this is one of the things that hopefully caught on with those Romans who were suffering, being persecuted because of what they were doing, following Christ. So in following Christ, the important thing is to be obedient to the Father and carry the cross and then follow in the footsteps of Jesus Christ, of course.
When you say carry the cross, is that a metaphor for...
Well, you and I carry a cross, but we carry it for different reasons. We have people in our lives that are crosses for us.
I see.
And we do carry them. And so that's one of the ways. We have temptations within us that sometimes are crosses to us. We wish we didn't have those temptations and inclinations, and they serve as a cross for us to carry. And you could name a whole number of different things that are crosses in our lives.
Songs have been written about not my cross to bear.
Yes.
So now it's easier for an old rock and roller to understand it that way. St. Mark was a good, colorful, descriptive writer.
He was. I mean, obviously, it's another thing that's interesting is because his gospel is by far the shortest, by far. You know, not too long ago, when you asked people the sequence of the Gospels, they would always say Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, that's not necessarily the sequence. Matthew was someone who wrote particularly for the Jewish community, and therefore a lot of the symbolism he uses is Jewish symbolism. He himself was familiar with it, and so he was able to use it. Now, Mark, on the other hand, wrote for the Christians in Rome. But what's interesting is Mark is just a very short gospel. Matthew was able to pick that up, as it were, and then expand on it, because Matthew's gospel is definitely longer than Mark's. So Mark is a very short gospel.
And you're a fan of all the
all
the
of
saints.
them. They're all different. There's nuances of differences with all four of the gospel writers.
Is he one of the easier ones to understand, perhaps?
One of the things we all make a mistake at is that we think the Bible is something that you pick up and read like a novel. Well, that's not the way it is, really. We pick passages and try to relate to those passages and then internalize them so that they become part of us. I think it's one of the things we have to keep in mind. You don't read the Gospels like you would a novel, but you read it according to your needs.
Why did we pick this date to celebrate the feast?
It's arbitrary.
It is arbitrary.
Yeah,
I thought that there was something possibly occurred on this particular date, but perhaps seemed like a good day to have a feast day for St. Mark.
Well, his history is so far away. It precedes us by many, many years, centuries and centuries, that it's very hard to know what happened on a daily basis with any of these people. But the church certainly has picked out feast days that are convenient and, work well within the liturgical year, and picks them as days to celebrate their feast, if you want.
So you were telling me actually sort of a funny story. You were talking about the burial of St. Mark, and actually, in a way, it has sort of an amusing tale to it. And you were also mentioning to me that these various areas were competing a bit, right? I mean, everybody wanted to be like Rome.
Definitely. So what happens is that the people of Venice, which was a republic, the Republic of Venice, was, vying with Rome, and they felt it's, you have Rome has St. Peter.
Yeah.
He's buried there. We need somebody. And, of course, they decided on Mark. And so two of the Venetians go over, they travel over to Alexandria. And I don't know how many centuries, but not too many centuries later, they went over to Alexandria. They were able to steal the body of Mark, but in order to securely get him across the lines, if you want, they covered his body with pork, knowing that the officials would all be Muslims, and therefore the Muslims would not go near pork. They couldn't touch pork without being looked upon as unclean.
So this was like a modern-day immigration going through...
In a way, yes.
Crossing the border.
But his body slipped right through, if you want. But once it got to Venice...
I'm laughing because it's very clever.
It is.
Yeah.
But in Venice, of course, if you ever go to Venice, one of the masterpieces of architecture worldwide has got to be the Basilica, the Cathedral of St Mark, which is the main church in Venice. The architecture is so detailed. It's unbelievable. It's I don't know how many years it took to build, but it was amazing to see the detail that's involved in the exterior structure as well as the interior structure. The interior structure is covered with mosaics and lots of silver and gold and all of these good things, if you want. But one of the things that relates to the little story we heard, the front of the cathedral, the doors, the story of the stealing of the body of Mark is on the doors in the form of mosaics.
Really?
And so that, in the old days, not everybody was able to read, but one way to get things across was through picture, and that's what they did. And so the Cathedral of St. Mark is beautiful. There's no question. I think it's architecturally one of the top buildings in the world. And it has the story of Mark's being moved, if you want, after death.
You got to give the two guys credit. Hopefully somewhere they managed to get their
rewards.
I wonder how they're pictured on those mosaics.
I don't know, to be honest with you, but
Can we go to Venice sometime, you and I, and we'll go and we'll look for the grave.
Well, who's your favorite agent? We can do that later.
Well, if Travelocity wants to advertise on the podcast,
why not? Why not? Let's look at it.
Let's do it tomorrow. So we've covered the fact that today is the feast of St. Mark the Evangelist. I can segue, Father, because I saw this in the same area that I saw St. Mark the Evangelist feast day. I saw the expression Rogation Day or Rogation Days. What does that mean?
Yeah, Rogation Days are a few days set aside throughout the year when we pray for or ask, because that's what rogation means. We ask for success in the farming community. So success in harvesting, and planting, obviously, at this time, but the idea of success with the growth of crops and plants and so on and so forth. So it really has to do with the farming. This is my own opinion. This doesn't rest on anything. All I can think of is that until a couple of hundred years ago, maybe even less than that, let's face it, the world was very much rural. The big cities had not really emerged yet. And so because it was so important for the livelihood of the people that the crops would be successful every year, the church set aside days when you prayed for that success. And that's what the Rogation Days are. They don't make a big deal of it anymore, so you don't ever hear officially that we're celebrating Rogation Days.
I bet they do in the farming communities. I think about traveling up I-75, and once you start to realize that you're no longer really in southeast lower Michigan, or you're starting to get up near the Zilwaukee Bridge, and you go through that time of the trip where you just see farms, big, vast, beautiful, huge farms. And my wife always used to have a great line. She would say, "Gosh, it's got to be hell for these kids around Halloween." Because the nearest house is 4 miles away.
Oh, sure.
You know? And I said, hon, I think they take care of that, okay? I think they probably
One way or another.
They have a common get-together for that one. But I would bet the churches up there are very active during Rogation Days. Or if I were a pastor in mid-Michigan in a farming community, I would certainly want to say a prayer for the farmers. I would gather as many farmers as I could.
You're right on.
Okay.
You're right on. I think that maybe I'm not involved with the rural community. Well, I was for a while in California.
Sure you were.
But during this time, I think pastors could make a big deal out of this.
Yeah.
It's hardly ever used anymore because it's optional. It's not required. However, you're right. It falls right around this time.
Yeah. You know, last week we were talking about the various blessings that go on. And you were talking about Pope Francis, as a matter of fact, blessing the motorcycle. So I put forth the proposition right now that we should at least consider getting Rogation Day back into the rotation, and I'm going to put you in charge of doing that. Is that okay?
As long as you go around with the petition.
All right. So now, is there anything that goes along with, is there anything that either in the past or right now that along with the Feast of St. Mark that people can take with them?
There's a cookbook that I don't even remember the name of it. In the Italian community, they have special foods for special days. And so that, you know, obviously Christmas is a big feast, and so you have special foods for that day. But they also have special foods for special feast days.
Special feast
There's
days.
a saint in November, St. Martin, okay? So in the Italian communities, all over the Italian communities, I'm not showing off, but I have to say something in Italian here.
Please do, yeah.
Ogni feste di San Martino, ogni musto diventa vino, which simply means this, that every time the Feast of St. Martin occurs, every must, do you know what must is?
Yeah. It's sort of musty in here.
No.
See,
My mind is going.
no, that's what
Must precedes wine.
Oh,
In the process of grapes becoming wine.
yeah.
For example,
Well,
when we go to visit the prisoners, you're not allowed to bring wine, but you're allowed to bring must with you. There is such a thing as must.
Okay.
And it's right before it becomes fermented. And so they say on the Feast of St. Martin, every must becomes wine.
Ah.
Because that's also the time for the vineyards to start tasting the new wines throughout Europe. See, in November, that's a good time to start tasting. Yes, this wine, I think it's going to be pretty good this year. And the other one would say, it has a long ways to go. And the other guy would say, oh, no, I think it's right at the top right now. So these arguments take place as they're tasting the wines for that year, you know, from their crops, of course. But it's not just that. It's actual foods, not just drink, that are very often designated with feast days. Now, there is a cookbook. I can't think of the name of it.
So you're telling me that if I go to Google and look for a cookbook that would relate to the feast days, I may actually find that cookbook? In other words, okay.
On the Feast of St. Joseph, they always serve what's called spingi
Okay.
or zeppole. And zeppole now has become a very fancy dessert in a lot of the restaurants.
Oh.
And all it is, it's like, well, I'm exaggerating, but all it is like a donut with cream on the inside. This
Sounds
type
like
of
an
thing.
eclair to me, but
Yeah,
or a
but
punchki.
yes, okay. The punchki is related to Lent.
Uh-huh.
The Italians have something very similar to that. They deep fry the dough and so on. Now, when you may not want to use it for this.
No, we do a wonderful thing here. We start talking about one thing, and then
Yeah.
you beautifully blend me into another area. So we've kind of traveled now from St. Mark, and we went around parts of Italy. We talked a little bit now about a cookbook relative to the saints and the actual Christian holidays. And now we're about to go, where are you taking me now, Father Grimaldi?
Well, let me put it this way.
Yeah.
On the eve of the Immaculate Conception,
Uh-huh.
that's December 8th, but the eve is the 7th. On that day, all of the local folks in certain areas of Italy and in other countries as well, they gather a lot of the dead wood from the forest, and they build this tremendous size bonfire. And around that bonfire are friends and relatives of the winemaker. And this is where it includes food as well. So here we are on the eve of the Immaculate Conception. As soon as the bell rings that it is officially the eve for the first Mass, they start taking out the old wine that they have on hand. And everybody has a glass of the old wine on hand. Now, if that's all they did is drink all night, they'd be drunk as skunks. So what they do instead is the ladies are there deep frying. They're like fritters, basically. Fritters that are either savory, where they would have, for example, inserted in that, like a donut, but anyway, into that piece of pastry, a sardine or an anchovy, or they could also be sweet, but mostly savory that they would have. And so they pass those around. They keep deep frying them while most of the men are standing around this bonfire, which is now beginning to be lit, and they have to now begin something new by tasting the new wines. And as they taste the new wines, that's when they make their comment. This is a little bit too light. It needs more body. Oh, no, this tastes great. I think this is going to make it big. In about a couple of weeks, we could start really using this wine. So we're ready for it. And so on and so forth. They all make their comments. So here you have why the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. I don't know, but it has to be then. I think part of it has to do with weather. The big bonfire. And when you look across the towns with an S, you have one bonfire after another. It's what a beautiful sight to see at night, And here they are tasting the fritters that the ladies are making while getting rid of the old wine and starting new wines. And then they end off the evening with what they call a spaghettata. Spaghettata is just sit down at a table and they have spaghetti with 3 different sauces. And so,
You're killing me. You're killing me.
But it's great to see that. I mean, it's really to experience that event is an amazing thing. For me, it was. And so they have the spaghetti with oil and garlic and breadcrumbs. You have your spaghetti with a fish type of sauce, and another one which is marinara without anything in it. So why that? Because they still believe it's not a rule of the church, it's a rule of the people. No meat on the eve of the Immaculate Conception. They want to treat it very special and so on. I know that's a nonsensical story, but it's true.
No, it's not. It's a great story. It's so great, in fact, that by the sound of my stomach, we have no choice but to say thank you for joining us for this particular podcast. I don't know about our dear friends that are listening right now, but thanks to that marvelous story, Father Joe, I'm starved. So what we're going to do right now is wander out into that kitchen. Well, I think we're going to probably look around for some must. Then we're going to look around for a little of the old wine, and then we're going to get a little of the new wine, and you are going to make me the best plate of spaghetti that this young man has ever had.
It sounds great.
It sounds like a deal to me. Thanks for joining us, everybody. It's Ken Calvert along with Father Joe Grimaldi. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, week. We'll see you the next time on the Father Joe Grimaldi podcast.
And I look forward to it. Thanks. This is Father Joe Grimaldi, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Father Joe podcast.
If you have a question or a comment for the Father Joe podcast, send it to fatherjoepodcast@gmail.com. That's fatherjoepodcast@gmail.com. Follow Father Joe on Twitter @FatherJoePodcast. The Twitter address again is @FatherJoePodcast. Please subscribe to the Father Joe podcast on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and soon on iHeartRadio. We also ask that you rate the podcast and feel free to leave a comment. And finally, if you have a friend that you think might enjoy the podcast, please pass it along. Thanks again for listening, everybody, and see you next time.